The frontier wind did not just blow, it bit. It carried tiny shards of ice that sliced against exposed skin, turning the muddy ground of the trading post into a frozen, unforgiving matrix. Eliza stood in the center of it all, tied by a length of rough hemp rope to the heavy timber rail of the public corral. She was shivering so violently that her teeth clicked together, an involuntary rhythm of sheer exhaustion. Her dress, once a respectable frontier blue, was stained with trail dust and torn at the hem. She didn't have a shawl. The men who had dragged her here, the men hired by her own uncle, had not allowed her such a luxury. They had dumped her at the feet of a traveling trader, taking $50 in exchange for removing the family problem. $50, the trader barked, pacing in front of her, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He addressed a small, indifferent crowd of miners and drifters who had gathered near the station's porch. That's what I paid her kin to take her off their hands. They said she was worthless, a thief, a liar, a bad omen. Look at her, skin and bones. I'll take 40 right now just to be rid of the burden of feeding her. Eliza kept her eyes glued to the frozen mud. She did not cry. Crying was a weakness her family had punished, and out here it only invited more cruelty. Her wrists burned where the rough rope dug into her fragile skin, leaving deep, purple bruises, but her right hand remained rigidly curled, her fingers pressing secretly against the inside of her torn sleeve. Hidden against her forearm, safe from the trader's greedy hands, was a folded, stiff piece of canvas paper, the torn map, the only proof that her father's land belonged to her, not the uncle who had sold her like a stray dog. She was terrified. The men watching her had dead, hungry eyes. If one of them bought her, she would disappear into a mining camp, never to be seen again. On the fringes of the crowd, standing beside a massive draft-cross horse, Elias Caldwell watered his mount. He wore a heavy leather vest over a thick wool shirt, a weathered buffalo coat hanging open despite the biting cold. A long, flat scar cut diagonally across his left eyebrow, giving his hardened features an intensely dangerous edge. He was a man the town instinctively avoided, a retired frontier scout, a man who lived up near the frozen pass and only came down when he absolutely had to. Elias watched the trader pace. He watched the crowd laugh, and then his steely gray eyes locked onto the girl tied to the corral. He didn't see a thief. He saw the violent trembling of a body pushed beyond its limits. He saw the purple bruising on her wrists. He saw a girl who had been stripped of her dignity and treated worse than the horse he was watering. $30, the trader yelled, throwing his hands up in mock defeat. Who'll give me 30 for this miserable creature? A drunken miner stepped forward, a leering grin missing half its teeth. I'll give you 20, and she can haul my wash water. 50, a voice rumbled. It wasn't a shout, but the sheer weight of the word cut through the howling wind like an axe blade. The crowd fell instantly silent. The drunken miner stepped back, his bravado evaporating as Elias Caldwell moved through the parting men. Elias walked with a slow, deliberate grace, his boots crunching heavily on the frozen mud. He didn't look at the crowd. He walked straight to the trader. Reaching into the deep pocket of his coat, he pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He didn't haggle. He didn't ask questions. He tossed the pouch and it hit the trader's chest with a heavy metallic clink. "There's 50, Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The transaction is done." The trader fumbled to catch the pouch, his eyes wide as he weighed the goal. "Now hold on, Hayes. I didn't say. I did," Elias interrupted. His hand drifted casually, yet purposefully, toward the heavy Colt revolver strapped low on his thigh. "You got your money. Walk away." The trader swallowed hard, looking at the dead, flat expression in the scout's eyes. Without another word, he backed away, stuffing the pouch into his coat and disappearing into the saloon. Elias turned his attention to Eliza. She flinched as his massive shadow fell over her, her right hand instinctively tightening over her sleeve to protect the secret map. She braced herself for a harsh word, a rough grab, the command of her new owner. Instead, Elias drew a long, wickedly sharp hunting knife from his belt. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut. Shh! The tension on her arms vanished instantly. The heavy hemp rope fell to the frozen mud. Eliza stumbled forward, her numb legs giving out. She expected to hit the ice, but a massive, incredibly solid arm caught her by the shoulder, steadying her effortlessly. Elias didn't grip her tight. He didn't pull her close. The moment she had her balance, he let go. He looked down at her bruised wrists, his jaw tightening just a fraction, a muscle ticking beneath his weathered cheek. "My horse is by the trough," Elias said quietly. He didn't ask her name. He didn't demand gratitude. He simply unclasped the weathered canvas canteen from his shoulder strap and pressed it gently into her trembling hands. "Drink. We ride out before the storm breaks." Eliza looked up into his face. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold but entirely devoid of the cruelty she had known all her life. Her frozen fingers wrapped around the canteen. For the first time since her family had betrayed her, she didn't feel entirely like prey. She took a small, shaky breath, held her torn sleeve tight against her side, and followed the silent mountain man through the snow. The journey up the mountain was a brutal lesson in endurance. The trail was less of a road and more of a suggestion carved into the granite spine of the frozen pass. Elias did not ride. He put Eliza on the back of his massive draft cross, adjusting the stirrups so her numb feet could find some purchase, and then he walked. He took the brunt of the headwind, leading the horse by the reins through snowdrifts that reached his knees. Eliza clung to the saddle horn, her entire body shaking. The cold up here was different from the valley. It was heavy, pressing against her lungs until every breath tasted like rusted iron. Through the blinding swirl of white, she watched the broad, unmoving shoulders of the man who had just bought her life for $50. He didn't curse the weather. He didn't stumble. He simply pushed forward, an immovable object, forcing its way through an unstoppable storm. She kept her right arm pinned tightly against her ribs, the torn piece of canvas map scraping against her skin inside her sleeve. It was her only leverage in this world. Her uncle had sold her to make sure she could never claim the land that map pointed to, but she had managed to tear it from his desk before the men dragged her away. If this mountain man knew what she carried, he would likely sell it, or sell her, back to the highest bidder. Men always had a price. She had learned that the hard way. Just as the last gray light of day bled out of the sky, a structure emerged from the whiteout. It was a frontier outpost, a heavy, wind-beaten cabin built from thick, unpeeled logs, and wedged into a rocky alcove that shielded it from the worst of the northern gales. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress meant to survive the end of the world. Elias halted the horse and walked back to her. He didn't offer a hand to help her down, sensing perhaps that she would flinch away. Instead, he simply unbuckled the heavy leather saddlebags. "We're here," he said, his voice a low rumble over the howling wind. "Get inside." Eliza scrambled down, her frozen legs almost buckling as her boots hit the icy ground. She followed him to the heavy timber door. Elias shoved it open, and they stepped out of the screaming wind and into absolute, profound silence. Air inside the outpost was freezing, smelling of old pine ash, tanned hides, and stale coffee. Elias immediately pushed the heavy oak door shut behind them, dropping a massive iron bar across the frame. The dull thud of the bar falling into place made Eliza jump. She was locked in. She backed up against the wall, her eyes wide, scanning the dim room. It was a single, large space. A cast-iron stove dominated the center, its black metal dull and cold. A rough-hewn table sat near a single window, boarded up against the storm. In the far corner was a bed frame, piled high with heavy wool blankets and a few wolf pelts. There was nothing soft here, nothing welcoming. It was the den of a solitary predator. Elias did not look at her. He didn't ask her to clean or cook or strip off her wet clothes. He simply went to work. He struck a match against the stone hearth, the sudden flare of orange light throwing his sharp, scarred profile into sharp relief. He fed dry kindling and birch bark into the stove, his movements incredibly precise, wasting no energy. Within minutes, the fire caught, and the iron stove began to tick and pop, radiating a fierce, desperate heat. Eliza remained pinned to the wall near the door. Her teeth chattered so loudly it echoed in the quiet room. In her family's house, when she was cold, she was told to work harder to warm up. In the trader's corral, she was left to freeze as a punishment for being worthless. She waited for Elias's command. She waited to be told what her $50 had bought him. Elias stood up from the stove. He turned and looked at her. He saw the way she pressed her back against the rough timber, the way her right hand awkwardly guarded her sleeve, the way her chest heaved with silent, trapped panic. He walked over to the bed, picked up a thick, heavy wool blanket, and walked toward her. Eliza tensed. She squeezed her eyes shut and turned her head away, raising her bruised left wrist instinctively to block a strike. The strike never came. Instead, a heavy, suffocating warmth fell over her shoulders. Elias had draped the blanket around her. He didn't let his hands linger. He didn't touch her skin. He stepped back immediately, leaving plenty of space between them. "The fire is warm," Elias said, his voice softer than she had heard it before, though still rough with disuse. "Stand by it." Eliza opened her eyes. She looked at the heavy blanket wrapping her, then at the man. He had already turned his back to her, taking his weathered canteen from his gear. He poured the half-frozen water into a small tin pot and set it directly on the hot iron of the stove. Slowly, tentatively, Eliza stepped away from the door. She moved to the stove, holding the blanket tight around her throat. The heat hit her face like a physical blow, so intense it almost made her dizzy. She sank onto a small wooden crate near the hearth. trembling as the warmth began to thaw the ice in her joints. Elias pulled up, another crate opposite her. He sat down, took a whetstone from his pocket, and began running his heavy hunting knife along the abrasive surface. Scrape, scrape. The rhythmic sound was hypnotic, completely at odds with the violent storm raging outside the thick log walls. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy. Eliza couldn't stand it. Silence usually meant a man was calculating how to use you. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, broken from the cold and lack of water. Elias paused his sharpening. He looked up, his slate-gray eyes locking onto hers. "Drink the water when it boils," he said flatly. "That's not what I mean." Eliza swallowed hard, her fingers digging into the edge of the blanket. "You paid $50 for me. Men don't throw away that kind of gold for nothing. Are you sending me to a mining camp? To a saloon?" Elias stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. He looked at the deep purple bruises circling her wrists, visible where the blanket slipped back. The muscle in his jaw flexed again. "I bought you from a man who was going to let you freeze to death for sport," Elias said, his voice devoid of any boastful pride. It was simply a statement of fact. "I don't own you. I don't run a saloon. And I don't expect anything from you." Eliza stared at him, stunned. Then, "Why?" "Because a corral is for horses," he answered gruffly, turning his attention back to his knife. "Not people." He reached out, taking the tin pot off the stove with a thick leather glove, and set it on the floor between them. The water was steaming. Eliza leaned forward, her hands shaking as she reached for the tin cup he set beside it. As she moved, the torn sleeve of her dress shifted, and the stiff edge of the canvas map poked out, brushing against her knuckles. She gasped quietly, quickly shoving it back up her arm, her eyes darting to Elias in sheer panic. If he saw it, he didn't say a word. He just kept sharpening his knife, his eyes focused entirely on the blade, leaving her alone with the fire, the water, and the heavy, terrifying realization that she might actually be safe. Eliza did not remember falling asleep. After days of being dragged through the mud, starved and terrified, her body simply shut down the moment the immediate threat of death was removed. When she finally opened her eyes, the dim gray light of a storm-choked morning was filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up window. She was no longer sitting on the wooden crate by the stove. She was lying on the heavy bed frame in the corner of the room, buried under a mountain of thick wolf pelts and wool blankets. It was the warmest she had been in weeks. Panic spiked in her chest. She sat up too fast, her breath catching in her throat as she frantically checked her clothing. Her torn frontier dress was exactly as it had been. More importantly, her right hand instantly flew to her left sleeve. She squeezed the fabric. The stiff, crinkling resistance of the canvas map was still there. She let out a ragged sigh of relief. Then she noticed him. Elias Caldwell had not slept. He was sitting in the same spot by the cast-iron stove, his back resting against the rough log wall. His heavy buffalo coat was draped over a chair, revealing the worn leather vest and the broad, unyielding line of his shoulders. His long legs were stretched out, and resting across his knees was a massive lever-action Winchester rifle. His slate-gray eyes were open, fixed on the heavy timber door.
Good morning.
He had spent the entire night standing guard over a woman he had bought for $50. As Eliza shifted under the pelts, the movement caused a sharp, tearing pain in her wrists.
Good morning.
She hissed, pulling her hands up to her chest. The hemp rope from the corral had done severe damage. The skin was rubbed raw, surrounded by deep, swollen bands of purple and black bruising that throbbed with every heartbeat. Elias turned his head at the sound. He didn't say a word. He stood up, resting the Winchester against the wall with practiced ease, and walked over to a small wooden chest near the hearth. He rummaged inside for a moment, pulling out a clean strip of white cotton and a small tin jar. He walked toward the bed. Eliza instinctively scrambled backward, pulling her knees up to her chest, her eyes wide like a trapdoor. She pressed her right arm tight against her side, guarding the map. Elias stopped a few feet away. He didn't try to close the distance aggressively. He pulled up a wooden stool and sat down, uncapping the tin jar. A sharp, bitter smell of pine resin, sulfur, and medicinal herbs filled the air. "Rope burns get infected fast," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble that didn't compete with the howling wind outside. "Out here, an infection will kill you quicker than a bullet." He held out his hand, palm up, a massive, heavily calloused hand, scarred from years of frontier survival. "Give me your wrists," he commanded gently.
Stay back.
Eliza hesitated. Her uncle had grabbed her wrists to drag her out of her own home. The trader had grabbed her wrists to tie her to the corral like a beast. Men's hands only brought pain. But she looked into Elias's eyes. There was no demand in them, no cruel expectation, only a cold, practical patience. Slowly, her hands trembling, she uncurled from her defensive posture. She offered her left hand first, keeping her right arm firmly pinned against her ribs. Elias took her hand. His grip was shockingly light. For a man of his immense size, his fingers moved with absolute precision. He scooped a dollop of the foul-smelling yellow salve from the tin and began to spread it over the raw, broken skin of her wrist. It stung fiercely. Eliza bit her lower lip, refusing to make a sound, a survival trait beaten into her by her family. But Elias noticed the slight hitch in her breathing. "Breathe," he muttered, not looking up from his work. "Holding it in makes the pain sharper." He finished the left wrist, wrapping it neatly with a piece of the cotton strip. He tied it off with a quick, efficient knot. He didn't linger. He immediately let go.
No cruelty.
"The other one," he said. Eliza's heart hammered. Her right wrist. If she extended her right arm, the torn sleeve would slide back. He might see the edge of the canvas map.
No cruelty.
She swallowed hard, her throat dry.
Only patience.
I can do the other one myself," she stammered, reaching for the tin with her bandaged left hand. Elias's hand clamped down over the tin, not hard, but immovable. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, the flat scar over his left eyebrow catching the dim light of the stove. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes. He saw the unnatural way she was guarding her right arm. He was a scout. He noticed everything. He knew she was hiding something. But Elias Caldwell was a man who had seen enough betrayal to know that trust could not be forced. It had to be earned. He released the tin. He didn't ask what she was hiding. He didn't demand to search her. He simply picked up the salve on his 2 fingers and held his hand out again. waiting. "You can't bandage it one-handed," he said quietly. "Keep your sleeve pulled down if you want. I only need the wrist." Eliza stared at him, completely unmoored. No one had ever respected a boundary she set. Cautiously, she extended her right arm, her fingers desperately pinching the torn fabric of her sleeve to keep the map hidden. Elias kept his word. He didn't pull at the fabric. He focused entirely on the bruised skin, applying the cooling salve and wrapping it with surgical care. As he worked, Eliza looked at his face. The deep lines etched around his eyes, the weathering of a man who lived entirely on his own terms. "Why did you do it?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it. $50. It's a fortune, and you don't even know me." Elias tied off the second bandage. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. "I know the men who sold you," he said, his voice darkening. "I know the trader who bought you. And I know that if I left you tied to that wood, the cold would have taken you by midnight. Some debts to the world are paid in gold. I had the gold." He stood up, taking the tin and the leftover bandages. Eliza sat on the bed, looking at her neatly wrapped wrists. The throbbing pain was already beginning to subside, replaced by a numbing warmth from the salve. A strange, terrifying sensation began to bloom in her chest. She had spent her entire life expecting cruelty. She didn't know what to do with mercy. She opened her mouth, the secret of the torn map burning on her tongue. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to explain why she had been sold, to prove she wasn't worthless. But before she could speak, Elias froze. He had just picked up the tin cup to pour coffee, but his hand stopped mid-air. His posture went completely rigid. The relaxed, quiet caregiver vanished in an instant, replaced by the lethal frontier scout. Eliza held her breath. "What is it?" she whispered. "Shh," Elias hissed, his head turning slightly toward the heavy timber door. The wind outside was a constant, deafening roar, shaking the roof beams and rattling the iron latch. To Eliza, it sounded like nothing but the storm, but Elias heard it. Underneath the screeching of the gale, there was a heavy, rhythmic sound. Crunch, crunch, footsteps, not an animal. The cadence was too deliberate, heavy boots breaking through the icy crust of the snow. And it wasn't just one pair. Elias set the cup down silently. In one fluid motion, he crossed the room, grabbed the Winchester rifle he had leaned against the wall, and levered a heavy .44 caliber round into the chamber. The metallic clack-clack of the action was the loudest sound in the room. He looked back at Eliza, his eyes cold and sharp. "Get off the bed," he ordered, his voice barely a breath. "Get down behind the stove. Now." Eliza did not hesitate. A lethal shift in Elias's demeanor shattered her paralysis. She scrambled across the rough floorboards, throwing herself into the narrow space behind the cast-iron stove. The metal radiated a blistering heat against her back, but the fear turning her blood to ice was stronger. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible, her hands clamped tightly over her ears. Elias did not crouch behind cover. He moved toward the front wall of the outpost, slipping seamlessly into the shadows beside the boarded-up window. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, completely silent despite his heavy boots and massive frame. He pressed his back against the thick logs, the Winchester held diagonally across his chest, the muzzle pointing toward the heavy timber door. Outside, the crunching of snow stopped. The howling wind swallowed the silence, but the tension inside the cabin was so thick it felt hard to breathe. Eliza watched Elias from her hiding spot. His slate-gray eyes were narrowed, tracking invisible movements through the thick wooden walls. He was listening to the subtle shifts in weight on the porch boards outside. "Caldwell!" The voice that shouted over the storm was muffled, but Eliza recognized it instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the trader. It was a man named Vance, her uncle's chief enforcer, a ruthless. She was trembling uncontrollably behind the stove, staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes.
Will make you rich.
He hadn't sold her. He hadn't bargained. He had stood directly in the line of fire, bleeding to protect a woman he owed absolutely nothing to. Elias walked over to the stove. He didn't yell at her for bringing trouble to his door. He didn't demand to know what she had stolen. He simply checked the water in the tin pot, noted it was still warm, and poured a cup of coffee, setting it on the floor near her boots. "They won't rush the door again," Elias said quietly, his eyes scanning the shattered window. "They'll try to wait us out, starve us, or freeze us." Eliza looked at the cup of coffee, then up at the massive, scarred man. Her chest felt incredibly tight. The cynical, defensive armor she had worn to survive her uncle's house, the trader's corral, and the brutal winter trail was cracking. They offered you $100, she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why didn't you give me to them? They told you I was a thief." Elias picked up his whetstone again, wiping a speck of dust from his knife. "Are you a thief?" he asked, not looking at her. "No," Eliza said, her voice catching. "Then it doesn't matter what they told me," Elias replied. "I don't deal in lies." He didn't ask anything else. He didn't press her. He gave her the absolute freedom to keep her secrets. And because he didn't demand the truth, Eliza found that she couldn't hold it back any longer. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She unpinned her right arm from her ribs. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached into the torn sleeve of her frontier dress. She pulled out the stiff, folded piece of canvas paper. Elias stopped moving. He looked at the object in her hand. "This is what they want," Eliza said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She unfolded the canvas and held it out toward the dim light of the fire. "It's a map. Half of a map." Elias slowly stood up. He walked over, his massive frame casting a long shadow, and looked down at the paper. It was an old, yellowed survey map, drawn in faded black ink. A jagged, violent tear ran straight down the middle of it. It depicted a geography of the Red Creek Valley, and near the bottom, written in a cramped, formal script, were the coordinates for a heavy silver vein and a deed of ownership bearing her father's name. "My father found a silver strike before he died," Eliza said, tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "My uncle wants it, but the bank won't honor his claim without the full map and the deed written on the back. I tore it in half before they dragged me out of the house. I hid this piece. If they find it, they'll kill me. They sold me for $50 just to get me out of the territory, hoping I'd die in a camp before I could ever claim it." She looked up at Elias, completely vulnerable, offering him a fortune that dwarfed the $100 Vance had promised. Elias Caldwell stared at the torn map for a long time, He saw the silver coordinates. He saw the immense wealth it promised. Then he looked at Eliza's raw, bruised wrists and her terrified, hopeful eyes. He didn't take the map. He reached out and gently pushed her trembling hand back toward her chest. "Keep it hidden," Elias said, his voice a low, fierce rumble. He turned back to the boarded window, racking the lever of his Winchester with a sharp, decisive snap. "They ain't getting the map, and they ain't getting you." Eliza's hands shook as she folded the piece of canvas and slid it back into the torn sleeve of her dress. She watched Elias Caldwell walk back to his position by the boarded window, his broad shoulders relaxed despite the lingering smell of gunpowder in the small room. He hadn't asked for a share. He hadn't demanded the map as payment for her life, or as compensation for the bullets he had just fired. In the world Eliza knew, every act of protection came with an extortionate price tag. Her uncle had raised her on the gospel of greed, teaching her that loyalty was just a transaction waiting to be outbid. "You don't want it?" she asked, her voice small against the howling draft rattling the timber walls. "It's half a mountain of silver, enough to buy 1,000 outposts like this, enough to never have to endure a winter again." Elias didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the narrow gap in the splintered wood. "Silver makes men crazy," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. "It makes them lie, and it makes them kill their own blood for a piece of paper. I came up this mountain to get away from men like that. I don't intend to carry their poison in my pockets." He stepped away from the window and walked over to a heavy burlap sack resting near the stove. He pulled out a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried venison, tossing them onto the wooden crate beside her. "Eat," he commanded. "Fear burns a lot of energy and the cold burns the rest. You need your strength." Eliza looked at the dried meat. Her stomach cramped violently, reminding her that she hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. She picked it up with her bandaged left hand, careful not to agitate the bruised skin, and took a small, hesitant bite. It was tough and salty, but to her starving body, it tasted like absolute salvation. She ate in silence, watching the man who had claimed her. He was a terrifying sight, a massive, scarred frontiersman with a heavy revolver strapped to his thigh and a Winchester resting easily in his grip. Yet sitting here in the dim orange glow of the cast-iron stove, she felt a profound, unprecedented sense of safety. The heavy timber walls of the outpost felt like the arms of a fortress, locking the cruelty of the world outside. But the world outside was not finished with them. Elias suddenly stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his head tilted slightly, his nostrils flaring. Eliza stopped chewing. "What is it?" she whispered, the familiar panic returning to her chest. "Smoke," Elias growled. He moved swiftly to the shattered window, pressing his face close to the splintered gap.
Thank you.
The wind was blowing fiercely from the north, carrying with it a new, acrid scent that overpowered the crisp smell of winter pine. It was the heavy, noxious odor of burning pine pitch and kerosene. "They ain't trying to shoot their way in anymore," Elias said, turning back to the room. His eyes were cold, calculating the geometry of their survival. "Vance is a coward, but he ain't stupid. He knows he can't breach a solid log wall without losing half his men. So, he's going to smoke us out. They're piling green brush and pitch against the windward side of the outpost." Eliza's blood ran cold. She looked up at the heavy timber ceiling. "Will it burn?" "The logs are thick, but the roof thatch under the snow is dry enough to catch if they get a fire hot enough," Elias explained, his voice tight with urgency. Even if the roof holds, the smoke will fill this box in 10 minutes. We'll choke to death before the flames ever touch us. The sanctuary of the outpost had just become a death trap. Elias didn't waste a second cursing their luck. He moved with explosive purpose. He grabbed a heavy canvas sack and began shoving his meager supplies into it. Ammunition, a tin of medicinal salve, extra woolen socks, and the hardtack. He tossed Eliza a pair of thick, oversized leather mittens. "Put those on," he ordered. "Keep your sleeves pulled down. Don't expose the bandages to the air." Eliza scrambled to pull the heavy mittens over her bruised wrists, wincing as the rough leather scraped against her skin. She clutched the torn map beneath the fabric, terrified of losing it in the chaos. Elias walked to the back of the outpost. Eliza hadn't noticed it before in the dim light, but there was a heavy interior door built into the rear wall. Elias unlatched it and kicked it open. It led to a small, enclosed lean-to attached to the main cabin. Inside, shielded from the worst of the wind, stood his massive draft-cross horse. The animal snorted, stomping a heavy iron-shod hoof against the dirt floor, sensing the tension in the air. Elias threw the heavy canvas sack over the saddle horn and tightened the leather cinch with a violent jerk. "We can't stay in the box," Elias said, turning to Eliza. He grabbed his heavy buffalo coat and shrugged into it, the collar turning up to shield his scarred face. "We break out through the back. The wind is blowing the smoke toward the front, which means Vance and his men are grouped up there tending the fire. We go hard up the eastern ridge. We make for the frozen river crossing." "The river?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling as she remembered the treacherous geography of the pass. "In this storm?" "It's a choke point," Elias replied, securing his Winchester in the saddle scabbard. "If we cross it, they have to follow single file. I can hold a dozen men off at the crossing. Out here in the open, we're just targets." Outside, a faint orange glow began to flicker through the cracks in the front window boards. The smell of smoke suddenly grew thicker, biting at the back of Eliza's throat. "Caldwell!" Vance's voice echoed through the storm, distorted by the wind and the crackling of flames. "I'm giving you one last chance. Throw the girl and the map out the door, and you can stay inside and roast your boots. Otherwise, you burn with her." Elias ignored the threat. He stepped out of the lean-to and picked Eliza up by the waist. He was incredibly careful, his massive hands avoiding her bruised wrists entirely, lifting her effortlessly into the heavy leat, her saddle. He handed her the reins. "Hold on," he instructed, his gray eyes locking onto hers with intense, unwavering focus. "When I open this door, the storm is going to hit you hard. Don't let go. I'll be right behind you." Eliza nodded, gripping the leather reins with her oversized mittens, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Elias drew his Colt revolver with his right hand. With his left, he reached out and grabbed the heavy wooden bar, securing the lean-to's exterior double doors. He didn't hesitate. He hoisted the bar and kicked the doors outward. The blizzard exploded into the small space like a physical entity. The wind screamed, blasting them with a blinding wall of white snow and freezing air. The draft-cross horse pinned its ears back and let out a shrill whinny of protest. "Go!" Elias roared, slapping the horse's heavy flank. The massive animal lunged forward, plunging deep into the snowdrifts. Elias sprinted directly beside the stirrup, his boots churning through the deep powder, his heavy frame cutting a path through the worst of the wind. They hadn't made it 20 yards when a shout rang out from the front of the cabin. They're breaking out the back. Get the horses. A figure appeared through the swirling snow, rounding the corner of the burning outpost with a rifle raised. Elias didn't even break his stride. He leveled his Colt revolver and fired a single, deafening shot. The muzzle flash illuminated the blizzard for a fraction of a second. The figure stumbled backward into the snow, dropping his weapon. "Keep moving!" Elias shouted over the roar of the wind, holstering his pistol and grabbing the horse's halter to drag the beast up the steep, treacherous incline. Behind them, the roof of the outpost finally caught. A massive plume of orange flame shot into the dark winter sky, illuminating the swirling snow like a shower of dying stars. Eliza looked back, watching her first real sanctuary burn to the ground. She turned her face forward, burying her chin into the thick wool of Elias's blanket, clutching the torn map in her sleeve. The world was freezing, and a group of killers was on their heels. But as she watched the broad back of the mountain man carving a path through the storm, she knew she would follow him into the absolute dark. The eastern ridge was a graveyard of ancient wind-twisted pines, their skeletal branches groaning under the weight of the blizzard. Elias Caldwell led the massive draft cross up the treacherous incline, his boots kicking steps into the ice-hardened snow so the horse wouldn't lose its footing. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He moved with the relentless mechanical drive of a man who understood that momentum was the only thing keeping them alive. Eliza clung to the saddle, burying her face against the horse's coarse M. The heavy wool blanket Elias had draped over her shoulders was stiff with frozen snow, but it trapped just enough of her body heat to keep her blood moving. Her bruised wrists throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and inside her torn sleeve, the canvas map felt like a block of ice against her skin. Behind them, the glow of the burning outpost had vanished, swallowed entirely by the whiteout conditions of the storm. But Elias knew Vance was still coming. Men driven by greed and the promise of a silver strike did not give up easily. After an hour of agonizing climbing, the dense timberline broke, revealing a sheer, terrifying drop-off. They had reached the river gorge. The wind shrieked through the narrow canyon, a deafening roar that vibrated in Eliza's teeth. Below them lay the river, a wide, violent artery of black, freezing water rushing beneath a thick, jagged shelf of winter ice. The crossing was a narrow bridge of naturally frozen water, spanning 50 yards of open gorge. It groaned and popped under the immense pressure of the current beneath it, a terrifying sound that echoed off the granite walls. Elias halted the horse at the edge of the ice. He turned to Eliza, his face a mask of pale intensity, the flat scar over his left eyebrow stark against his wind-burned skin. "The ice is thick enough to hold the horse, but you have to keep moving," Elias yelled over the storm, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Do not stop in the middle. Do not look down. You get to the far bank, and you ride for the tree line." Eliza looked at the treacherous expanse of groaning ice, then back at Elias. He wasn't grabbing the reins to lead the horse across. He was drawing the heavy Winchester rifle from the saddle scabbard. "What about you?" she shouted, panic slicing through the freezing air. "I'm the choke point," Elias said, his voice hard, absolute. He stepped back from the horse, gesturing toward the ice. "They have to come out of the tree line to cross. I hold them here. You ride." "No!" Eliza cried, her voice cracking. "They'll kill you. There are 3 of them left. Eliza slapped the horse's flank hard. Ride, Eliza. The draft cross lunged forward onto the ice. Its iron-shod hooves slipped for a terrifying second before finding purchase, the heavy beast instinctively lowering its head to navigate the slick, groaning surface. Eliza grabbed the saddle horn, her oversized mittens slipping slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was moving across the gorge, leaving him behind. She reached the halfway point. The ice popped loudly beneath the horse's weight, a sound like a rifle shot, but the shelf held. Then the real rifle shots began. From the tree line Elias had just left, muzzle flashes erupted through the blinding snow. Vance and his 2 remaining men had broken through the timber, mounted and desperate. Elias was already in position. He had taken cover behind a massive, jagged boulder of ice shoved up against the riverbank. He didn't panic. He leveled his Winchester, tracking the first rider through the swirling whiteout. He fired. The roar of the heavy .44 caliber rifle echoed through the gorge. The lead rider was thrown violently from his saddle, plunging into a deep snowdrift and not moving again. "Spread out!" Vance screamed, his voice carrying over the wind. "Pin him down!" Vance and the last man dismounted, using their panicked horses as temporary cover, and unleashed a hail of lead toward Elias's position. Bullets chipped and shattered the ice boulder, sending razor-sharp shards flying into the air. Elias ducked, levered another round, and leaned out to return fire. As he did, Vance fired his repeater blindly. A stray bullet, deflected by the jagged ice, caught Elias high in the left shoulder. The impact spun the massive scout backward. He grunted, a short, sharp sound of sudden agony, and collapsed against the snow-covered bank. The Winchester slipped from his grasp, clattering across the slick ice out of his reach. Blood immediately began to soak the heavy canvas of his coat, a stark, terrifying red against the pristine white snow. Eliza reached the far bank. The horse scrambled up the rocky incline and stood panting in the safety of the distant tree line. She was across. She was safe. She had the torn map in her sleeve, and the horse could carry her miles away before Vance ever managed to cross the river. She could survive. She oaked back across the 50 yards of groaning ice. Elias was down. He was clutching his left shoulder, struggling to draw the Colt revolver from his thigh holster with his right hand. Vance saw it. The enforcer let out a cruel bark of laughter and stepped out from behind his horse, raising his rifle to finish the scout off. Eliza's breath hitched. Her uncle had told her she was worthless. Her family had sold her like a broken tool. Every survival instinct she had ever honed screamed at her to kick the horse and ride into the blinding snow. But Elias Caldwell had not run. He had stood in front of a burning door for her. He had offered his canteen, his blanket, and his blood for a woman he owed absolutely nothing to. Eliza did not kick the horse to run away. She yanked the heavy leather reins, turning the massive draft cross back toward the sheer drop of the gorge. "Yeah!" Eliza screamed, kicking the beast's flanks with everything she had. The draft cross roared a defiant whinny and surged forward. It didn't step gingerly onto the ice this time. It charged. 2,000 pounds of muscle and iron-shod hooves hit the frozen river crossing like a freight train. The ice cracked and screamed in protest under the immense pounding weight. Vance froze. He looked up from his rifle sights to see a monstrous horse and a wild-eyed woman charging directly across the narrow ice bridge out of the whiteout, screaming through the storm. The sheer audacity of the charge broke Vance's concentration. He hesitated for a single, fatal second, stepping backward on the slick ice to avoid the charging beast. It was all Elias needed. Fighting through the blinding pain in his shoulder, Elias drew his Colt. He didn't hesitate. He didn't issue a warning. He leveled the heavy revolver and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot was deafening. The heavy lead slug hit Vance squarely in the chest. The enforcer's eyes went wide. He stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the smooth ice. He hit the ground hard, his weight slamming onto a fragile stress fracture in the ice shelf. With a sickening crack, the ice gave way. Vance didn't even have time to scream before the black, freezing water of the river swallowed him whole, dragging him under the thick, frozen crust. The remaining man took one look at the shattered ice, the charging draft horse, and the bleeding scout with a smoking revolver. He dropped his rifle, scrambled onto his horse, and fled blindly back into the blinding snow. Eliza hauled back on the reins, bringing the massive draft cross to a sliding, frantic halt just feet from where Elias was kneeling in the snow. She didn't wait for the horse to fully stop. She threw herself out of the saddle, hitting the icy ground hard, and scrambled over to him. Elias was breathing heavily, his face pale, his right hand still gripping the Colt tightly. He looked up at her, genuine shock breaking through his stoic, guarded features. "I told you to ride," he rasped, his voice tight with pain. Eliza dropped to her knees in the freezing snow beside him. She reached out with her bandaged hands, ignoring the pain in her own bruised wrists, and pressed her thick leather mittens hard against the bleeding wound on his shoulder. "You paid $50 for me," Eliza said, her voice shaking but fiercely defiant. She looked directly into his slate-gray eyes. "I wasn't about to let you lose your investment."